In this video, we're going to analyze 4 widely used types of motion capture, namely active, passive motion capture technology, and computer vision or video processing, and we'll give some pros and cons of each different type of motion detection. We will discuss some of our research around these types of motion sensors and present our own implementations of ultrasonic and infrared sensors, object trackers, and optical flow algorithms using the Python library OpenCV. Oftentimes, there isn't a singular best answer when it comes to motion detection. Rather, one must determine the right settings for their own motion detection application. Our code snippets will provide an example of parameter settings that best work for our own applications. Having an understanding of what each parameter represents can be of service to anyone looking to use motion detection for their own purposes. At the end of this video, we'll go over some main takeaways about motion detection as a whole. All active motion sensors work in a pretty similar way. They send out a signal via a transmitter, and that signal bounces off an object of interest, and it will receive that signal back with a detector. And it continually measures how much time it takes for the signal to return to the detector, and signals motion if that measurement changes. In the case of ultrasonic motion detectors, which is a motion sensor still commonly used today, these signals are ultrasonic sound waves. By continually tracking this time delay, a few basic calculations can be made to actually track the velocity of the object. Another common way ultrasonic motion detectors work is by taking advantage of the well-known Doppler effect by comparing the frequency of the transmitted waves to the returned waves. Now, some advantages of active motion sensors, such as the ultrasonic one, is that it is a pretty simple and cheap setup, as you can see with our example here. And velocity detection can actually be somewhat accurate with these sensors. However, some weaker sensors can have difficulty at further distances, and it really only provides a pretty simple analysis of motion. Also, ultrasonic sensors can be quite susceptible to false detections. However, playing with the minimum velocity threshold required for the signal to fire can help counteract this. Passive motion sensors, on the other hand, do not send out signals. They simply detect signals already present in the environment. One common signal that is an indicator of motion in life forms is simply heat, and this is why passive infrared sensors quickly became the most common form of motion detection for security purposes, starting in roughly the 80s. They detect infrared radiation produced by humans, or put more simply, they just receive thermal energy, and a high enough change in energy level will trigger the sensor. These motions are great for security purposes because they base their motion detection on heat, and security primarily cares about detecting life forms, and it is proven to be a reliable motion detection choice in the industry. And like the ultrasonic detector, the infrared sensor was a very easy setup. However, this motion sensor is quite basic. All it really does is detect that something is there. And similar to the ultrasonic detector as well, it is quite susceptible to false alarms, such as non-human life forms. That being said, like the ultrasonic detector, we can tweak its settings to cater to how we want to use it. As you can see here, decreasing the sensitivity of our sensor lowered the maximum distance at which it would begin to detect motion. Next, we'll discuss motion capture, which has been around for quite a while, but modern 3D motion capture didn't really emerge until the 90s. This is the technology that has powered countless animated Disney films and video games. It works by attaching sensors, also known as markers, to a live person, setting up multiple cameras from a variety of angles, and through some complicated mathematics along with some complicated software, analyzing the positions of these sensors frame by frame to create a 3D model of this person that can be used for animations. What's great about motion capture is that using markers and multiple cameras allows for quick collection of massive amounts of motion data. As a result, the 3D models generated via motion capture can be extremely precise. Just consider how realistic modern animations sometimes appear. Unfortunately, this form of motion capture requires a difficult, expensive setup with lots of hardware and powerful computing power in order to process such high amounts of data. In a bit, however, we'll look at how these motion capture techniques are being replicated without the usage of such markers. So we've arrived at motion detection via computer vision, that is, detecting motion directly from video input. And here's where motion detection processes really begin to differ from the previous three. In fact, computer vision might even have some overlap with human vision, as we'll see. In general, the technique used for motion detection in videos is called the difference of frames technique. That is, the pixel values of one frame are subtracted from those of the previous frame to detect the changes from frame to frame, which might indicate motion. The pre-processing of frames and post-processing of the difference of frames can differ significantly depending on the type of motion we are trying to detect, but this is the basic idea behind it all. Computer vision can be broken up into two main types: object tracking and optical flow. Object tracking is the detection of movement of singular objects. We tried out object tracking in a Python library known as OpenCV. While looping through every frame in the video, we performed the following computations on consecutive frames. First, we simplify the frames by blurring them, since having an extremely high resolution isn't really important for detecting the motion of a singular object, as long as that object isn't very small. And there's two purposes to this. One is to prevent the detection of minor movements, and the other is to reduce computational expenses, which can be quite important when repeating this algorithm for every pair of consecutive frames in a video. And the filter we use to blur our images is the Gaussian filter, which is a common filter used for image simplification in computer vision in many more applications than just motion analysis. Now that we've simplified, we can actually go ahead and take the difference of frames, which is called the frame delta. This is where the actual motion is revealed. Next, we applied a threshold to the delta frame to pick up less noise, and we set our threshold at the default value of 1. We then dilate the delta frame in order to bridge small gaps in the image, since once again, we don't care about tiny details in motion. Now finally, for each delta frame, we calculate the bounding box that will actually track the moving contour of a large enough size. As you might already be able to imply, one of the huge advantages of this type of motion detection is how easy it is to tweak. Unlike ultrasonic and infrared sensors, there are many parameters we can play with to achieve the type of motion detection that we want. For our particular video, which was shot on a busy street in Boston, we don't really want to pick up on subtle motion. By increasing the size of the Gaussian kernel, we get greater blurring, meaning that finer details are ignored. To control the velocity our motion detection captures, we can adjust the alpha values to make it easier to kind of pick up on slow-moving objects. The minimum contour size is another adjustment that we can play with, which basically adjusts the object size our motion detector focuses on. This type of motion detection is also quite versatile. It can detect fast and slow-moving objects quite well. But when it comes to disadvantages of this type of motion detection, well, it's kind of hard to think of many, but obviously a computer is required. Also, adjusting any parameter means that some sort of trade-off is made, which can make it difficult to sometimes find the parameters that are just right. And also, object tracking is somewhat limited in its application. It really just applies bounding boxes to moving objects, but it doesn't really track the bigger picture of motion in a scene. But that is exactly what our next motion technique, optical flow, attempts to do. To put it simply, optical flow is motion detection that does more than just focus on an object. It tracks the movement of everything. For example, let's say we're trying to figure out not how fast an object in the visual field is moving, but how fast the frame of reference itself is moving by tracking all of the surrounding movements. For humans, optical flow is a pretty natural phenomenon. The reason we so easily maintain balance when we walk is because we are unconsciously aware of our movement relative to our surroundings. This phenomenon is so unconscious and so automatic, it is sometimes referred to as zombie vision. Optic flow has been difficult to replicate in computers, however. A famous algorithm used to calculate optic flow is the Lucas-Kanade method, which is actually built directly into OpenCV. The main idea behind it is to directly calculate the motion vector at every pixel by calculating the displacement of pixels between consecutive frames. Take a look at this equation. H is the new image and I is the old image. This equation is basically just saying that the new image is just the old image with its pixels shifted in the horizontal and vertical direction by particular delta values, namely U and V. The job of the Lucas-Kanade algorithm is to determine these U and V values. First, some method must be used to choose the interesting pixels to focus on that the Lucas-Kanade algorithm will actually be run on. Oftentimes, these interesting pixels are corners, which can be calculated using algorithms such as the Harris corner detection or Shi-Tomasi algorithm. Now, here's where the Lucas-Kanade algorithm comes in. At each interesting point, it tracks a small window of pixels. As long as the window is large enough and the movement is small enough, when a particular pixel, quote-unquote, moves from one frame to the next, it will still remain in this window. But remember, at first, the computer isn't actually aware that the pixel moves. In the second frame, the computer must search for a matching pixel of the same brightness, also known as intensity, If this matching pixel is in a different location in the window than the original, the algorithm will conclude that movement did indeed occur. This is where something called the brightness constancy constraint comes in. The algorithm assumes that the brightness of the pixel being tracked does not change from frame to frame. If the brightnesses didn't remain the same, the algorithm wouldn't be able to match up the pixel from one frame to the next. Like with object tracking, we actually ran into some trade-offs. If we turn up the window size in which pixels are tracked, the idea is that faster movements should be tracked more easily because in a larger window, a larger movement of a pixel can be picked up. However, the Lucas-Canate algorithm really only works well on the smaller, more subtle pixel-by-pixel changes in optical flow, and we found that a smaller window size did even better on faster movements, such as the truck. Like with other computer vision methods, it was quite easy to tweak Lucas-Canate optical flow just by altering parameters in the dictionary that we input into the function. Optical flow itself is a difficult problem to solve, but the Lucas-Canate algorithm, despite being relatively simple, tackles it pretty well. However, as we saw, it only works well for detecting small displacements, and we have the brightness constancy constraint we have to deal with, whereas humans tend to care much less if the brightness of an area changes while it's moving. We can also run into the well-known aperture problem, since the Lucas-Canate method tracks movements in small window sizes. The aperture problem is a topic for another video and is something that shows up in human vision as well. But basically, the movement in pixels in a certain direction might lead the algorithm to infer one thing, when the actual larger feature we're trying to track is not moving in accordance with that singular pixel. This explains why corners are selected as focus points of the algorithm, because corners are indicative of the movement of the whole object, since they allow for little ambiguity. In human vision, these such focus points are often referred to as terminators, but even they can present their own problems. We also looked a bit into the Farnaback algorithm, which is inspired by Lucas-Canate, and received the following results in a more dense optical flow field. I also just wanted to discuss a quick application of optical flow just to show how useful it is. In Final Cut Pro, the software I used to edit this video, an image stabilization feature exists that uses optical flow. Basically, if the algorithm calculates enough motion vectors pointing in the same direction, that is indicative of camera movement, and an adjustment is performed to counteract this detected motion. While we're on the topic of motion detection in computers, we thought we might bring up an interesting overlap that we came across between computer and human motion detection and their capabilities relating to what's called sampled motion. This type of motion is the kind of motion present in a video because videos are really just a bunch of frames, each of which is a sample of the actual motion present. Computers only ever perceive sample motion because the only motion-related thing inputted into computer vision algorithms are, well, videos. Humans, on the other hand, encounter both smooth and sampled motion, but actually do quite a good job at dealing with sampled motion as long as the frame rate is high enough. In fact, sampled motion at a high enough frame rate is actually indistinguishable from smooth motion. Our receptive fields simply don't pick up on small gaps in motion. Pose estimation is the final form of motion analysis we'll look at, and it provides some glimpses into how motion detection might play out in the future and the role that machine learning might play in it. It's called pose estimation because its job is to try to accurately estimate the pose of a person in all frames of some provided footage. Earlier, we had discussed the usage of motion capture technology to generate 3D models of characters, but this requires an expensive, detailed setup, whereas pose estimation is possible with just some 2D video. In a sense, it's motion capture without sensors. Here's an example of some basic 2D pose estimation. 3D pose estimation, however, is a more challenging problem, but also provides a more detailed analysis of pose. The basic idea is that computers can learn with the usage of neural networks to infer where key points, such as major joints, on a person are located. An image is inputted, and the neural network outputs a heat map of key points, basically probabilities that a key point exists in a particular area of an image. Most models for 3D motion-based pose estimation occur in the following steps. First off, training. 2D images of a particular pose are provided as input to the neural network, and 3D models generated from motion capture data corresponding to this image are used as what's known in neural networks as the ground truth output. That is, the 3D model that the neural network should construct given a certain 2D input. Accurate results in neural networks result from quite a lot of training, so techniques are being worked on to increase the size of these training data sets because it can be quite hard to find 3D motion capture data just lying around. Once trained, the neural network can actually go ahead and classify the poses of given 2D images. The input frame is sent through a convolutional neural network, and the heat map is recorded. Then this output is run through another network that's trained on pose data, which determines whether the estimated key points are even realistic, and if they aren't, it just scraps them. Finally, the resulting frames from step 2 are stitched together in a way that results in a smooth transition of poses, and then we have something that looks like this. Pose estimation has countless applications. In the medical field, it's being used to detect irregularities in movement and joint position. For animation purposes, especially video games, pose estimation is being used to create more natural and diverse motion of characters rather than just using some canned animations created with standard 3D motion capture technology. What's different about pose estimation when compared to other computer vision techniques is its preciseness. Unlike object tracking, which basically just places bounding boxes around objects, or optical flow, which for the most part, tries to see what's moving, pose estimation actually predicts the exact location of particular key points of an object. But at the same time, it doesn't require an insanely difficult setup. It just needs to have a well-trained neural network. Yes, mocap data is required to train it, but once the neural network is trained, it is ready to be used on any basic 2D images. A well-trained network can perform well even without a lot of data. For example, even occluded images or 2D videos taken in the dark with a few sensors can be enough to create pretty accurate pose estimations, as this one study showed. To end this video, we just wanted to discuss some takeaways from our overall motion detection analysis. One thing we realized is that when it comes to motion detection, newer does not always mean better. Who knows, maybe in the future pose estimation will win out over the usage of mocap, but we must be aware that there are pros and cons to different types of technologies. There's a reason that infrared sensors are still the go-to sensors in many security systems today. Another important takeaway we found was that the abilities of motion detectors are not fixed. Tweaking parameters is an easy process, but it does result in trade-offs. We can tweak infrared sensors to avoid picking up noise, and we can play with parameters in the difference of frames techniques to determine the amount of subtlety we are willing to pick up on. We can tweak the window size in the Lucas-Conade algorithm to either precisely approximate motion vectors or track larger changes with larger windows. And when researching various pose estimation algorithms, we came across hundreds of competing algorithms, all of which calculate poses in slightly different ways, some optimizing efficiency, while others optimize precision. Now, a final thing to note is that motion sensors all have one thing in common that makes them unique from other forms of vision. They use the dimension of time to their advantage. Time is a helpful dimension because it provides that much more data to work with. Rather than a singular image, we have a sequence of images to work with. The best pose estimation techniques infer joint positions using motion data, not by just inputting a singular static image of a person. Now, ultrasonic sensors have more than one ultrasonic wave to work with, which means they only have to detect the difference between them. This makes motion detection actually easier than many other problems in computer vision. We can also see the usefulness of time when it comes to vision in life forms. In most species, motion detection is by far the dominant visual capability, and they have difficulty picking up on static images. We as humans are simply lucky enough to see static images, but for most other life forms, change over time is required for any sort of vision. The time dimension might not be easy for us to understand conceptually, but it sure is ingrained into how our brains work, and as we've seen, computers can benefit from change over time too.